The call came on a Tuesday morning, and Nora Calloway almost let it go to voicemail. She was standing in line at the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment on Colfax Avenue in Denver, holding a numbered ticket that read 47, watching the digital display above the service windows cycle slowly through 31, 32, 33. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at a frequency that seemed designed to make everyone in the room feel slightly worse about their circumstances. The woman ahead of her was filling out a form against the wall, pressing too hard with her pen, and the scratching sound of it had been going on for 3 minutes. Nora's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. Unknown number, Wyoming area code. She almost didn't answer. The last three unknown numbers had been a debt consolidation service, a survey about her internet provider, and a recording that claimed her social security number had been compromised. She had learned over 6 months of financial contraction that unknown numbers rarely delivered good news. She answered anyway. The man on the line introduced himself as a legal assistant from a small firm in Casper. He spoke her full name carefully, the way people do when they are not certain the name still belongs to anyone. Nora Calloway. Then he said her grandfather's name, Rupert Calloway. Something tightened in her chest, immediately sharp and sudden, the way cold air feels when it reaches somewhere it shouldn't. The man spoke in a practiced, neutral tone. Rupert Calloway had passed away 4 days prior at his property in Converse County. He had been 78 years old. The firm had been retained as executor of his estate, and they were contacting all listed beneficiaries to arrange attendance at the formal reading of the will scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning at their offices on David Street in Casper. Would she be available? Nora said yes. She said she understood. She said she would be there. When the call ended, the display above the service windows read 34. She stood there for a moment, the phone still in her hand, the numbered ticket still in the other. The woman ahead of her had stopped writing. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Nora became aware that she was pressing the ticket so tightly in her fingers that the paper had begun to crease. She had not spoken to her grandfather in almost 2 years. Not because of anger. There had been no falling out, no final argument, no moment of rupture she could point to as the thing that ended regular contact. It had been slower than that and quieter. After her parents divorced and her mother moved out of state, the connective tissue of family had simply gone slack. Her Aunt Lorraine had never encouraged visits. Her cousin Brent had made clear from an early age that he considered Rupert an embarrassment, a man who had failed at the one thing men in Wyoming were supposed to succeed at, which was holding on to land. And Rupert himself had never been a man who asked for company. He lived the way certain people do when they have been disappointed enough times that self-sufficiency stops being a choice and becomes a kind of permanent condition. What Nora remembered of him was not grand. It was specific. The smell of cedar and machine oil that clung to his jacket when she was small, and he lifted her over a fence. The way he listened without nodding, which had frightened her as a child and made sense to her later. The morning he had taught her to read a topographic map on the hood of his truck, tracing contour lines with a calloused finger, explaining how terrain told you where water would go before you ever saw the water itself. She had been 12 years old, and she had not thought about that morning in years. She thought about it now, standing in line at the unemployment office, the display cycling to 35. She put her numbered ticket in her coat pocket. She walked out. The drive to Casper took a little under 5 hours from Denver north on I-25 through the wide-tilted emptiness of the Wyoming high desert. Nora made the drive on Wednesday night and slept in a motel off Center Street, a clean, inexpensive place that smelled of industrial detergent and old carpet. She lay on top of the covers for a long time before sleeping, watching the ceiling, listening to trucks move through the intersection outside. She had calculated her finances on the drive up. 6 months without steady work had taken most of what she had saved. She had contract work, intermittent, the kind that paid enough to delay disaster by another 3 or 4 weeks at a time. Her car was running, but needed tires. She owned in total very little that could not fit into the back of it. She was not thinking about inheritance. She did not permit herself to think about inheritance because She had grown up enough to know that expectation was just another form of debt. She was thinking about her grandfather, about the cedar smell, and the topographic map about the fact that she had not called him in 2 years and now would never be able to. That was the thing that kept her awake until nearly midnight. The offices of Whitmore and Associates were on the third floor of a brick building 1 block west of the Casper Courthouse. The conference room had beige walls and a long table that seated 12, and when Nora arrived at 9:55, 8 of those seats were already occupied. Lorraine Calloway Fitch sat at the left side of the table closest to the window. She was 55 years old, the kind of well-maintained that announced itself without apology. Her hair was the color of winter wheat cut just below the chin, and she wore a blazer that probably cost more than Nora's monthly rent. Harlan Fitch sat beside her, a broad man of 58, with the deliberate stillness of someone who had long ago learned that speaking less made people assume he was thinking more. Brent sat at his father's right, a younger and louder version of the same general architecture, wearing a sport coat over a collared shirt, scrolling his phone with the restlessness of a man who had already decided how the morning would end. Two cousins Nora barely recognized sat further down the table. A family friend, a man who turned out to be the accountant. No one stood to greet Nora when she entered. Lorraine offered a brief, controlled smile, the kind that acknowledged presence without extending warmth. Harlan nodded once. Brent did not look up from his phone. Nora took a seat near the far end, set her coat on her lap, and folded her hands. The attorney, a thin man named Whitmore, who wore rimless glasses and spoke with the unhurried authority of someone who had done this hundreds of times, began at precisely 10 o'clock. He outlined the process. He thanked everyone for attending. He opened the folder in front of him and began. The Calloway estate, as it turned out, was more substantial than Nora had expected. There was a house in Glen Rock, a 3-bedroom property with an attached garage, valued at just over $300,000, which went to Lorraine outright. There was a second property near Cheyenne, a smaller house that Rupert had apparently rented out for years, which went to the two cousins in equal share. There were 2 vehicles, a late model pickup and a 4-year-old SUV, which went to Lorraine and Brent respectively. There was a brokerage account and a retirement account, each with named beneficiaries already established, and neither of them was Nora. She watched Lorraine's posture through all of this. It did not change. It was the posture of someone receiving what they had already been promised. Then Whitmore adjusted his glasses, turned a page, and said Nora's name. The room shifted in a way that was not quite audible. Nora felt it rather than heard it, a slight change in the quality of the attention directed toward her. Whitmore read the relevant portion of the document. A parcel of land measuring 42 acres located in Converse County, Wyoming, described in the deed as Section 14 of the original Calloway land grant, including all existing structures thereon. The primary structure was described in attached documentation as an agricultural barn of wood frame construction, built approximately 1947 in varied condition. A barn. Whitmore continued describing the location, the lack of utilities on the structure itself, the gravel access road that connected the property to the county road 3 miles north. He did not editorialize. He did not offer condolences. From across the table, Brent Fitch made a sound. It began as something he was trying to suppress and became briefly a short, compressed laugh that he converted at the last moment into a cough. He raised his fist to his mouth. His eyes, however, did not change. He said it then, not loudly but not quietly either, the kind of statement calibrated to be heard without being quoted. Classic Rupert, gave the dead weight to the one who can't afford a lawyer. No one at the table said anything. Lorraine turned her head very slightly toward the window. Harlan examined his thumbnail. The cousins studied the surface of the table. Whitmore continued as if nothing had been said because in legal terms, nothing had. After the reading, there was a brief period in which people gathered their things and spoke in the low, efficient tones of people who had already moved on to the next task. Lorraine touched Nora's arm on the way out lightly, the kind of touch that conveyed sympathy without committing to it. I know it's not what you were hoping for, she said. If you want, Harlan knows people who handle rural property. They could take it off your hands quickly, probably get you something reasonable. Nora said she would think about it. Lorraine's smile held for exactly one more second. Then she moved toward the elevator. Nora walked to her car and sat in it for a long time before starting the engine. She had the deed and a county assessor's map in a manila folder on the passenger seat. The barn was located 41 miles northeast of Casper on a county road that the map indicated as mostly unpaved for its final stretch. She had no particular plan for what she would do when she got there. She was not even certain she should go at all. The practical reality was that a 42-acre parcel with an old barn structure and no utilities in Converse County, Wyoming, was not nothing, but it was far from what she had needed. She had needed something convertible, something with immediate value, something that could, in blunt terms, cover the next 3 months. What she had was a barn. She started the engine anyway. The drive northeast from Casper moved through a landscape that shed human ambition, gradually the way a fever breaks. The city gave way to the outskirts, then to scattered development, then to nothing much at all except the broad, undulating reach of the high plains, pale gold in the November light, the sage low and silver at the road's edge. The sky was enormous here in the way that only open country sky can be, not threatening, but simply present too large to ignore. The kind of sky that made the concerns of cities feel provisional. She passed through Douglas on Highway 20, a town of 8,000 or so that sat along the North Platte River, its water tower visible from a long way off. She needed gas, and she pulled into a station at the edge of town, a small independent place with 2 pumps and a narrow convenience store attached. The man behind the counter was old enough that his age was no longer easy to estimate. 70s, possibly. He had the kind of face that outdoor decades produce, weathered and specific, with eyes that moved to the door and assessed the situation before anything else happened. He wore a canvas shirt and watched Nora approach the counter with the attention of someone who has nothing better to do and has made peace with that long ago. She paid for the gas and a bottle of water. She had the folder in her hand, and she set it on the counter briefly while she found her wallet. The man's eyes moved to the county assessor's letterhead visible through the folder's open flap, then to the road direction printed on the map. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically but noticeably, the way a face changes when a name connects to a memory. "Callaway Land," he said. Nora looked up. "My grandfather," she said. "He passed away recently." The old man was quiet for a moment. He scratched the side of his jaw. "Rupert Callaway," he said, less as a question than as a confirmation of something he had been retrieving from memory. "Yeah, I knew who he was. Turned down 4 offers on that land in the last 10 years, at least 4 that anybody knew about. Harlan Fitch was the last one who came around maybe 3 years ago. Word was he offered a lot." He paused. "Word was your grandfather laughed at him." Nora said nothing. She was watching the old man's face. "You be careful out there," he said. He handed her the change without looking at it. "I mean that as actual advice, not just something to say." She drove the remaining 41 miles without turning on the radio. The county road turned to gravel 18 miles out, as the map had indicated. The gravel gave way to packed dirt for the last 3 miles, and Nora's car registered its objection through the steering wheel in steady low vibrations. The land on either side was open and dry, the kind of terrain that looked empty until you looked at it long enough to see the structure in it, the shallow drainages, the slight rises, the places where the vegetation thickened along lines invisible from the road. Rupert had told her once that you could read land the way you read a face if you spent enough time with it. She saw the barn before she expected to. It rose from a low rise in the terrain, dark wood against the pale November sky, standing alone without any other structure visible in any direction. From a distance, it looked exactly like what it was described as old weathered, the kind of thing that had been standing long enough to become part of the landscape rather than a feature of it. One corner sagged slightly. The roofline dipped toward the east. The boards were silver gray in places and darker brown in others, the variation of long exposure to sun and cold, and the particular cruelty of Wyoming weather, which did not bother to be dramatic about what it did to things. Nora slowed the car without meaning to. She parked on the flat ground in front of the structure, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel. The silence was immediate and total. No traffic noise, no mechanical hum, just wind moving across the open ground and the faint creak of something settling in the cold. She got out. The first thing she noticed was the ground. The area immediately surrounding the barn had been cleared of the dead vegetation that covered everything else in a 20-yard radius. Not recently cut, but recently enough. Within the last few weeks, maybe. The absence of accumulated leaves and broken sage branches around the base of the walls was distinct from the surrounding terrain in a way that took her a moment to understand. Someone had been maintaining this place. She walked the perimeter slowly, hands in her coat pockets, studying the boards. They were old, yes, but the sill plates where the walls met the ground showed no significant rot. The boards themselves were thick, thicker than modern construction would use, and in several places she could see evidence of repair work done at different times, different wood, different hardware, all of it integrated into the existing structure with patience rather than haste. Someone had kept this thing standing deliberately over a long period of time with attention rather than money. The door was on the south face. It was a wide sliding door on a rail, the kind that was standard in working barns of that era. She took hold of the iron handle and pulled. The door resisted for a moment, not because it was stuck, but because it was heavy and well-balanced, and then it moved smoothly with a low rolling sound, rather than the grinding she had expected. The hardware on the rail was clean, recently oiled. She stepped inside. The smell reached her first. Not rot, not the damp and abandonment she had braced for. Instead, something drier and older. Aged wood and ash and the stillness of enclosed space that has been out of the weather for a very long time. Light came through narrow gaps between boards and through two small openings near the peak of the roofline, and in the first few seconds, her eyes processed the space as simply large and dim and largely empty. Then she saw the walls. They stood inside the barn like a structure within a structure. Wooden walls, smooth and tight, rising from the floor to about 10 feet, forming a rectangular shape roughly in the center of the barn's floor plan. They were set back from the outer walls on all sides, leaving a corridor of space between them, and from where Nora stood, they looked solid, deliberate, and completely out of place in a working barn. There was no agricultural reason for interior walls like these. No practical functions she could immediately identify that explained their presence. She walked toward them slowly. The boards on the interior walls were different from the barn's outer cladding. Darker, smoother, the grain worn to a dull polish in places that suggested long contact with hands rather than weather. They had been fitted together tightly, overlapping at the seams, leaving almost no visible gap. The craftsmanship was not decorative. It was functional in a way that went beyond carpentry, the way something is functional when it has been tested rather than merely designed. On the south-facing side, there was a doorway cut into the wall, low perhaps 6 feet with no door in the frame. Just a threshold. Nora stopped in front of it. She stood there for a moment looking at the darkness beyond. Then she stepped through. The air changed immediately. Not warm, but different from the cold outside. The biting quality was gone. It was as if the air in here had been removed from the general weather and left to settle on its own terms, cooler than a heated room, but warmer than it had any physical right to be given the temperature outside. Nora stood still and simply felt it. This contained quality, this resistance to the season pressing in from beyond the walls. The space inside was a single room divided partially by a low wall that created a secondary area to the north. The floor was stone-fitted pieces of flat rock set into the earth with care, the seams irregular but tight. Along the west wall stood a cast-iron stove, small and darkened by years of use, its surface scarred and its legs set on flat stones that had been leveled carefully. A narrow shelf ran along the east wall at chest height. Above it, a small opening in the interior wall had been fitted with a piece of thin board on a pivot, a simple vent manually operated. Nora stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. Her grandfather had not simply stored things here. He had lived here. She could see the evidence of it in the proportions of the space and the placement of the shelf, at exactly the height of a man working alone, in the way the stove was positioned relative to the only door in the small recessed niche, cut into one wall that would have held, she thought, a lamp or a radio. Everything was stripped to necessity with the economy of someone who had thought carefully about what was essential and had not bothered with anything else. She ran her palm along the interior wall. The boards were cold, but when she knocked lightly, the sound was dull rather than hollow. Something had been packed between layers. She pressed harder with her fingers. The wall did not give, but she could feel the density of it, the thickness that went beyond a single layer of board. She was still standing there, palm flat against the wall, when she noticed the board near the floor in the northwest corner. It was set at the same height as the others, the same weathered gray, but something about its edge was different, worn smoother. The wear on it was not the distributed scuffing of general use, but concentrated at one corner where a finger or thumb would naturally press if the board were being shifted from its position. Nora knelt. She pressed the corner. The board moved, not loosely, not accidentally. It shifted inward with a controlled, deliberate motion, as if it had been designed to do exactly this. She felt along the edge, found the slight gap where it could be gripped, and eased it back. Behind it was a narrow space between the interior and exterior walls, maybe 8 inches deep, running vertically for about 2 feet. Inside, folded carefully, was a single piece of paper. She took it out with both hands. The paper was old. Yellow at the edges, the fold lines darkened with age. She unfolded it slowly, holding it up toward the light coming through the high vent. The handwriting was immediately recognizable. She had seen it on the birthday cards he sent until she was 16, on the back of photographs her mother had kept on the deed and map paperwork she had received from the attorney's office. Strong, angular, precise. The letters made with a pen, held firmly, each stroke deliberate. Not the handwriting of a man in decline. She read it. 4 lines. If you're reading this, it means you stayed long enough to see. This place kept me alive when nothing else would. Don't rush it. It will tell you what you need if you listen. She read it twice, then a third time. She folded it back along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands, and stood that way in the cold, contained air of the room her grandfather had built inside a barn in Converse County, Wyoming, and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to. He had known someone would come. He had written the note knowing that. And the fact that the note was there at all meant that he had believed at some point in the last years of his life that whoever found this place would be someone capable of being told to stay and listen, rather than someone who would need to be told to hurry and decide. She thought about that for a long time. The afternoon light was shifting by the time she emerged from the cabin and walked back through the outer barn to stand in the open. The temperature had dropped several degrees in the hours since she had arrived, and the sky to the west had taken on the flat, dense quality that preceded a cold front. Nora stood in front of the barn and looked at it from the outside again, now seeing it differently. Not as an old structure in poor condition, as a shell, a casing. Something that had been allowed to look like it had no value precisely because it held something of value inside. Her grandfather had understood something about camouflage that had nothing to do with deception and everything to do with survival. She went back to her car and sat in it with the heat running, eating the granola bars she had brought from Denver and drinking water from the bottle she had bought at the gas station in Douglas. The old man's words were still there, carried in her memory. Turned down 4 offers. Harlan Fitch was the last one. Your grandfather laughed at him. She thought about the way Harlan Fitch had sat at the conference table that morning, the way he had not reacted to Brent's comment, not with disapproval and not with encouragement, as if the comment had simply been a piece of information delivered in an acceptable register. She thought about the fact that Harlan Fitch ran a real estate development company. She knew this because Lorraine had mentioned it over the years with the pride of someone who has attached their security to someone else's success. Harlan had built subdivisions outside Cheyenne. He had developed a commercial strip in Laramie. He was, according to Lorraine, very good at identifying opportunity before anyone else recognized it as such. A 42-acre parcel with an old barn on it was not on its face an obvious opportunity. Nora turned that thought over slowly. The light was fading now, the low sun catching the gray boards of the barn and pulling gold from them in a way that was almost architectural. She had a motel reservation in Casper, 41 miles back down the gravel road. She should leave now if she was going to make it before dark. Her phone vibrated. The number was one she did not recognize, but the Wyoming area code was different from the attorney's office. She looked at it for a moment, then she answered. The voice was smooth and measured with the warmth of someone who has practiced sounding natural. He introduced himself as Harlan Fitch, Lorraine's husband, Rupert's son-in-law, and said he hoped she had had a chance to get some rest after what he acknowledged must have been an emotional morning. He said he had been thinking about her situation and wanted to offer some assistance purely as family, no obligation attached. He had contacts in rural property, people who specialized in estates exactly like this one, and he thought he could get her something fair without any of the complications that came with managing land at a distance. He spoke for almost 2 full minutes without asking her a single question. When he finally paused, Nora said that she appreciated the call and that she was still getting her bearings and would be in touch. Harlan said, of course, no rush at all, take all the time she needed, and his number would be easy to find through Lorraine if she needed it. The call ended. Nora sat with the phone in her hand. Then she looked out through the windshield at the barn, dark now against the fading sky, solid and motionless in the cold. She thought about the note. 4 lines. If you're reading this, it means you stayed long enough to see. She did not go back to Casper. She took her bag from the back seat and carried it into the barn. She found the kerosene lantern she had noticed on a nail near the door and the box of matches on the shelf beside it, and she lit it carefully, adjusting the wick until the light was steady and warm. She carried it into the inner cabin and set it on the shelf. She ate the second granola bar she had been saving. She sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall her grandfather had built with his own hands, insulated with whatever he had found available, tested through Wyoming winters she could not entirely imagine. And she listened to the wind begin to move against the outer walls of the barn. The outer walls caught it, deflected it. The sound reached the inner cabin as something distant and managed a pressure converted to atmosphere by the time it arrived here. She thought about what it must have taken to build this. Not the physical labor, though, that was considerable. The knowledge of it, the trial and error, the winters that had taught him what the books did not cover. She thought about the kind of man who responds to loss not by rebuilding what was lost, but by building something the loss could not threaten. Her grandfather had not been a man who gave up. She had always known that vaguely in the way you know things about family members you do not see often. But knowing it abstractly was different from sitting inside the evidence of it in a room that existed only because he had decided it would. Outside, a vehicle slowed on the county road. She heard it clearly in the night quiet, the sound carrying across the open ground with the clarity that cold, dry air gives to distance. The vehicle did not turn onto the access road. It slowed, and then it stopped, and then the engine idled. Nora got up without hurrying and moved to the doorway of the inner cabin. She stood in the darkness of the outer barn and looked through a gap in the boards toward the road. Headlights pointed away from her, which meant the vehicle had come from the direction of Douglas and pulled to the shoulder facing away so that its lights would not point toward the barn. A precaution. A deliberate orientation. She watched for a long time. The vehicle did not move. The engine continued to idle. No one got out. She went back to the inner cabin and sat down against the wall. She had not decided anything. She was not ready to decide anything. But she was aware with a clarity that the note and the drive and the day had built in her steadily that whatever her grandfather had left here was not a burden placed on someone he had forgotten. It was something placed with precision in the hands of someone he had thought about for a long time. The wind pressed against the outer walls. The lantern held steady. At the road, the headlights remained off, and the engine continued to idle patient and unannounced in the dark. Nora pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes and listened to the barn do exactly what it had been built to do. Nora woke before dawn with her cheek against the stone floor and her coat pulled to her chin and the disorientation of someone whose body had slept somewhere it had not agreed to trust. For a moment she lay still, not moving, letting her senses reach outward the way her grandfather had once described years ago as the most important thing a person could learn to do. Before you react, he had said, find out where you are. Most of the mistakes people make happen in the first 3 seconds after they open their eyes. She found where she was. The inner cabin, the stone floor beneath her cool but not painful. The lantern on the shelf burned out sometime in the night, the wick cold. The walls closed and solid in the dark. And outside them, the barn, and beyond the barn, the open Wyoming land in the last of the pre-dawn dark. And at the road, if it was still there, the vehicle she had watched from the gap in the boards before she finally stopped watching and let sleep take her. She sat up slowly. Her back registered the night on stone with a long, even ache that she acknowledged and set aside. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and breathed in the air of the room, which was, she noticed again, with the same quiet surprise she had felt the night before, considerably warmer than it had any right to be. Outside, the cold was immediate and physical. She could hear it in the way the barn's outer boards had contracted slightly in the night, the subtle shifts and settlings of wood responding to temperature. The sound was not alarming. It was the sound of a structure that had made this adjustment thousands of times and knew exactly how to do it. The vehicle was gone. The road was empty, the pale outline of the gravel visible in the first gray suggestion of light coming from the east. She stood in the open barn doorway for a moment, the cold finding her face and hands. The land stretched away in all directions, still and enormous, the horizon beginning to separate from the sky in a line of deep blue that would become gold in another hour. She thought about the man at the gas station in Douglas. The weight of those words. Your grandfather laughed at him. She went back inside. The morning began as the previous evening had ended, with Nora moving through the inner cabin slowly with attention. She had slept here, and her body had made a claim on the space that changed her relationship to it, the way a single night somewhere can shift a place from foreign to familiar in ways that are not entirely rational, but are entirely real. She examined the walls again in the growing light that came through the high vent openings. She traced seams with her fingertips pressed at irregular junctions, tested the floor stones with the toe of her boot. Her grandfather had told her once that the best work was always invisible, that if you could see how something was made, it meant the maker had not finished thinking about it yet. She had been 14, and he had been talking about a fence repair, and she had not understood what he meant. She understood now. The cavity she had found the night before behind the loose board in the northwest corner had given her the note. But the note had told her to listen, and the note had told her the place would tell her what she needed. She did not think the note was the only thing he had put here. She worked methodically. East wall, south wall, the partial dividing wall, the floor around the stove. She was not rushing. She was paying attention the way the morning demanded. The loose board she found on the west wall near the back of the space behind the partial divider did not behave like the first one. This one did not have a pivot point. It had been fitted so precisely into the surrounding boards that the only indication of its separateness was a seam that ran straight where the others ran, with a natural variation of aged wood. She would have missed it if she had not been running her palms slowly along the entire surface. She pressed. Nothing. She pressed the top edge. Nothing. She knelt and pressed the bottom edge near the floor, and the board shifted inward by 1/4 of an inch and held. She worked her fingers into the seam on the right side and pulled carefully, and the board came free in her hands, smooth and deliberate. The back of it, fitted with 2 wooden runners that slid in channels, she could now see cut into the boards above and below. This was not accidental concealment. This was designed. Behind the board was a space deeper than the first, 14 inches, perhaps more. The interior of it was dry, the wood of its walls darkened with age, but without any softness that would indicate moisture damage. On the floor of the cavity, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth, and then a piece of canvas duck cloth that had been tied with a length of waxed cord, was a bundle roughly the size of a large dictionary. Nora carried it to the shelf and set it under the light from the vent. She untied the cord, carefully preserving the knot because something about its deliberateness seemed important. The canvas came away to reveal the oilcloth, and the oilcloth came away to reveal a collection of items that had been wrapped together but were not a single thing. There were 4 notebooks, Composition books, the kind with black and white marbled covers, their spines intact, their pages dense with the same angular handwriting she had read on the note. There was a manila envelope sealed fat with contents. There was a smaller envelope sealed, also her name written on it in the same hand, and the ink on it was clearly not old. The letters were sharp and dark. He had written her name on this envelope recently. She set the smaller envelope aside. She set the notebooks in order, numbered 1 through 4 on their front covers in permanent marker. She opened the first notebook. Rupert Callaway had not written a diary in any conventional sense. What he had written was more precisely a record, the kind a careful and methodical man makes when he understands that memory alone will not be sufficient. The entries had dates, but the dates were not uniform. Some were daily, some had gaps of weeks. What remained consistent was the register of the writing, which was precise and unsentimentally observational. The way a man writes when he is writing for a purpose rather than for the comfort of expression. She read, "The early entries describe the sale of the original Callaway Ranch in 2011. Not the emotional experience of that loss, though the emotion was present in the compression of certain sentences in a way that was unmistakable. What the entries described in detail was the process, the sequence of events that had led to the sale, the names, the dates, the specific language of specific conversations. He had written these things down within days of them happening, and the precision of the detail was the precision of someone who had already decided he did not trust his own memory to carry something this important. The picture that assembled itself across the first 40 pages was not complicated. A developer had identified the water potential in the land. He had approached Rupert through an intermediary initially, then directly. Rupert had declined. The offers had increased. Rupert had continued to decline. And then in the spring of 2011, financial circumstances had changed in a way that did not feel entirely accidental. A loan called early. A supply contract with a local operation canceled without explanation. A piece of equipment that had been serviced and returned in a condition that required expensive repair. One thing after another, each individually explicable, collectively a pattern. Rupert had seen the pattern. He had written about it without self-pity and without the kind of outrage that makes a man's account of his own treatment sound unreliable. He had written about it the way a good surveyor marks difficult terrain, noting what was there without arguing with it. The sale had been completed in August of 2011. Rupert had received significantly less than the land was worth under circumstances that he described in careful detail in the final entries of the first notebook. Nora closed the first notebook and sat still for a moment. She opened the manila envelope. The documents inside had been organized. Not randomly filed, but arranged the way a person arranges things when they understand that someone else will need to use them. Rupert had worked from the outside in placing the most recent documents on top and the oldest beneath, and he had written small identifying notes in pencil on the top corner of each document, the kind of notes that explained in plain language what she was looking at without obscuring the document itself. The first document was a copy of the 2011 sale agreement. She recognized the format from the document she had signed when she rented her apartment, the particular arrangement of signature lines and notary stamps, and attached addenda that legal documents carry. She looked at the bottom of the page. 2 signatures, a notary seal, and above each signature line the printed name of the signatory. The first name was Harlan Fitch. The second name was Lorraine Callaway Fitch. Nora read it twice. She had understood from the notebooks that Harlan Fitch had been involved. But Harlan Fitch was a developer. Harlan Fitch identifying an undervalued piece of land and engineering a situation to acquire it was a thing she could construct a moral framework around, ugly as that framework was. It was the behavior of a predator, but it was at least the behavior of a predator operating in his own interest. Lorraine was Rupert's daughter. Lorraine had grown up on the land that was being sold. Lorraine had sat at the conference table in Casper 2 days ago and received her inheritance with the composure of someone who had been waiting for it for a long time. The signature on this document was not a forgery. Nora had seen Lorraine's signature on a birthday card once years ago, and the loops and angles of it were specific enough to be recognizable. This was the same hand. She sat with that for a long time. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, testing the outer walls in long, sustained pushes that moved along the boards with a sound like breathing. Inside the inner cabin, the sound arrived filtered and distant. Nora was only marginally aware of it. She continued through the documents. Rupert had assembled the record of the transaction with the thoroughness of someone preparing a case. There were copies of correspondence letters received and carbons of letters sent. There were notes from 3 separate conversations with 3 separate attorneys, 2 of whom had told him the transaction was legally sound, and 1 of whom had been more carefully ambiguous. There were pages from a title search. There was a letter from the bank explaining the terms of the early loan recall. And then, beneath all of it, in its own separate, smaller envelope, within the larger one, sealed and labeled in pencil with 2 words, Nora found something she had not expected. The label read, Water Study. She opened the envelope. Inside was a folded report, 22 pages printed on the letterhead of a geological consulting firm out of Laramie. The date on the report was March of 2019, 8 years after the original land sale. Rupert had commissioned this independently. The report described in technical language the subsurface hydrology of a defined geographic area that corresponded, when she checked the map coordinates against the county assessor's map in her folder, to the land she was currently standing on and a substantial area surrounding it. The conclusions of the report were set out in the executive summary on page 2 in language clear enough for a non-specialist to understand. The property identified in Section 14 of the Converse County Land Grant sits above a confined aquifer system with estimated yield capacity significantly exceeding any residential or agricultural application in the immediate area. The aquifer represents a water resource of regional significance. Nora read the paragraph twice. Then she turned to the back of the report where a 1-page addendum had been paperclipped. The addendum was not from the geological firm. It was from a water rights attorney in Cheyenne, and it was addressed to Rupert Callaway. The relevant portion read as follows. Regarding the water rights associated with the deed for the property at Section 14 Converse County, the water rights filed under the Callaway name in 1987 are senior rights attached to the deed and cannot be conveyed separately under current Wyoming law without agreement of the deed holder. As we discussed, these rights would represent a significant impediment to any development project in the watershed area that did not control them, and their value in the context of proposed commercial or residential development in the county is considerable. We recommend you maintain these rights actively and ensure the deed transfer documentation in your estate planning reflects their attachment clearly. Nora set the report on the shelf beside the notebooks and stood looking at it. Her grandfather had known. He had known for at least 5 years that this land was not simply a 42-acre parcel with an old barn on it. He had known what was underneath it, and he had known exactly what that meant, and he had said nothing to anyone. She thought about Harlan Fitch at the conference table. The way he had made no visible reaction to anything during the reading of the will, not to the house, not to the vehicles, not to the moment when Nora's name was read alongside the description of an agricultural barn in Converse County. He had sat exactly the same way through all of it. That composure was not indifference. It was the practiced stillness of a man who had already decided what would happen next. Her phone had signal here, faint but sufficient. She had 2 missed calls, both from Lorraine's number, and a text from Brent that read, "Heard you stayed out there. Smart to get a look at it before you decide. Let me know what you think." She did not respond to any of them. She sat on the floor with a second notebook and read through the afternoon. Rupert's account of the years following the 2011 sale was not a story of defeat. It was a story of construction, both literal and deliberate. He had taken what remained to him, which was this parcel, the barn, the legal attachment of the water rights that had survived the original land sale, because the sale documents had been structured by Harlan's attorneys to acquire the surface rights while leaving the water rights ambiguous, and Rupert's own attorney at the time had caught the ambiguity and insisted on explicit language preserving them. It was Rupert wrote the one thing he had done right in a season when he had done almost nothing right. He had moved into the barn that winter, not out of romance, out of necessity. The entry for that first December read simply, "No heat except what I make. No insulation in the walls. Temperature last night was 11 degrees, starting from scratch. What followed over the next 2 years of entries was a detailed account of the construction of the inner cabin. He had not set out to build anything ambitious. He had set out to not freeze. But the problem of staying warm in an uninsulated structure in a Wyoming winter turned out to be an interesting problem, and Rupert Calloway had been above everything else a man who engaged honestly with interesting problems. He had begun with a single interior wall on the north side, the coldest exposure, then a second on the west. He had learned from the first two walls what the third needed to be, which was not merely a second layer of board, but a cavity between layers that could be filled. He had experimented with filling materials, dried grass, layered cardboard wool from a neighbor's surplus, eventually a combination that held heat without trapping moisture. He had discovered by accident that the mass of the stone floor retained heat from the stove long after the fire itself had died, and had deliberately increased the floor mass on the western side where the cold came hardest. He had built failed, revised, rebuilt. The entries were not sentimental. They were reports. But reading them, Nora felt the shape of the years behind them, the winters that had been survived by understanding and attention rather than by resources he did not have. She was on the third notebook when she heard the vehicle. It was not the same one as the night before. This one came down the access road without hesitation at a speed that announced itself as deliberate, and it parked beside her car in the flat space in front of the barn. She heard the door close, then footsteps on the frozen ground, unhurried and direct. She set the notebook down and walked through the inner doorway into the larger barn space. She did not pick up the documents. She left them where they were and walked to the barn's sliding door and opened it and stepped out into the afternoon light. Brent Fitch was standing 10 feet away, his hands in the pockets of a heavy winter jacket, his expression calibrated to read as casual. He was 33 years old and had the build of his father, broad through the shoulders, and the manner of someone who had grown up watching a particular kind of confidence be rewarded. His rental truck was a late model, full-size, the kind of vehicle that communicated that the person driving it did not think about the cost of things. He looked past her briefly at the barn and then back at her. "Cold out here," he said. "Yes," Nora said. He smiled. It was a real enough smile in that it reached his eyes, but it was the smile of a man who had already completed the calculation that lay beneath the conversation. "I figured you'd head back to Casper, maybe Denver. Didn't expect you to actually stay." "Here I am," Nora said. "Yeah." He looked at the barn again. "Here you are." He took a breath. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you're a straight-up person, and I don't see any reason to waste either of our time." He shifted his weight slightly, a movement that closed the physical distance between them by perhaps 6 inches, subtle enough to be deniable as intentional. "My dad has a project in this county, a real one, the kind that changes the value of everything around it. He's been working on it for a while, and this land, the parcel you've got, it's sitting right in the middle of something that needs to move." He paused as if giving her time to understand the importance of what he had said. "Name your price," he said. "Whatever number you're thinking right now, double it. That's where we'll start." Nora looked at him without expression for a moment. She was aware of the notebooks on the shelf inside the cabin. She was aware of the report from the geological consulting firm. She was aware of the document with Lorraine's signature. She was aware of all of it, and she kept all of it completely still inside her. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said. Brent's smile did not disappear. It recalibrated. "These situations have timelines," he said. "Project timelines, county approval windows. I'm giving you an early look at this because you're family, more or less, but the window doesn't stay open." "I appreciate that," Nora said. He studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he apparently did not find it. He nodded once slowly. "I'll leave you to it," he said. "But don't take too long." He turned back toward his truck. At the door, he stopped and looked back. "This is a long way from Denver. You sure this is where you want to be right now?" She did not answer. He got into the truck and drove back down the access road at the same unhurried speed he had arrived. Nora stood in front of the barn until the sound of his engine faded entirely. Then she went back inside. She found Meredith Oaks through the Wyoming State Bar's online directory, cross-referencing against reviews on 3 separate platforms with the care of someone who understood that the next conversation she had with a lawyer was not one she could afford to get wrong. Oaks had a solo practice in Casper, specializing in property and estate law. She had been licensed for 22 years. Her reviews described her as direct and thorough, which was exactly what Nora needed. She called from inside the cabin, sitting on the floor with the documents arranged around her. Meredith Oaks answered on the second ring, listened to Nora's summary without interrupting, and asked 3 questions at the end. What was the date on the deed? What county recorded the water rights? And had anyone from the other parties contacted Nora directly or only through the estate attorney? Nora answered all 3. There was a pause on the line. Can you scan those documents and send them to me tonight? I don't have a scanner, Nora said. I have a phone. Photograph each page. Make sure it's legible. Send them to my email and I'll look at them tomorrow morning. Another pause. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything verbally. And don't tell anyone what you found in that property until we've spoken. Understood, Nora said. One more thing. Meredith Oaks's voice had the precision of someone choosing words carefully. The water rights you're describing, if they're senior rights attached to a deed in Converse County, they're not a minor issue. I want to pull the county records before we talk further, but I want you to understand that you may be holding something considerably more significant than a piece of agricultural land. She said it not to impress Nora, but to calibrate her. The way a good navigator tells you the weather before you set out, not to frighten you, but because you need to know. I understand, Nora said. She spent the next 2 hours photographing documents in the flat light, coming through the barn's high vents, holding each page steady, checking each image for legibility before moving to the next. She photographed the notebook's key pages, the ones with specific dates and names, and the account of the 2011 sale. She photographed the geological report and the water rights addendum. She photographed both signature pages of the sale agreement, including the line where Lorraine's name was printed above Lorraine's signature. She sent all of it to Meredith Oaks's email address. Then she sat with the third notebook and continued reading. The entry she found in the late afternoon in a section dated January of the previous year stopped her cold. Rupert wrote about a conversation he had overheard in the Douglas hardware store, 2 men behind him in line talking without awareness of him. He did not record the men's names. He recorded what they said. They were discussing a land acquisition in Converse County, a project that had been quietly moving through county planning channels. The project was described in terms that made its scale clear. Not a small development, something larger. Something that would require, according to one of the men, a water source that none of the existing parcels in the development zone could provide independently. Rupert had come home that afternoon and pulled out the geological report for the first time in 2 years and read it again from the beginning. Then 3 entries later, he had written a single sentence that Nora read twice and then a third time before she turned the page. I think they've been waiting for me to die. She set the notebook on her knee and sat with that sentence for a long time. She called Meredith Oaks again. The attorney answered from what sounded like her office. I was going to call you, Oaks said. I pulled the county records this afternoon. There's something you need to know. She paused. Harlan Fitch, through a development LLC registered in Delaware, filed a project application with the Converse County Commission 6 weeks ago. A large-scale residential and commercial development on a consolidated land package in your area of the county. Another pause, deliberate. The application was filed 3 weeks before your grandfather died. The cold in the barn felt different for a moment, more specific. 3 weeks before, Nora said. That's what the timestamp shows. The filing is a matter of public record. I pulled it this afternoon. Oaks's voice was steady and precise. Now it's possible this is coincidental. People file development applications, and people die, and sometimes the timing overlaps. But given what you've sent me regarding the 2011 transaction, I would say this warrants very careful attention. Nora was quiet. Are you all right? Oaks asked. Yes, Nora said. I'm thinking. Take your time. Nora was thinking about Lorraine at the conference table. The controlled smile, the brief touch on her arm on the way out, the offer of help that had been waiting in her mouth before the reading had even finished. The composure of a woman who had known for weeks how it would end, who had sat beside a man she had helped destroy her own father and received her inheritance without a tremor in her expression. The distance Lorraine had built between herself and the life her father had lived out here, year by year until the distance became her whole address. She thought about what it meant to file an application 3 weeks before the man whose land you needed was still alive. It meant either that you had information about his health that was not publicly available, or it meant that you had calculated his life expectancy with a coldness that Nora found difficult to fully absorb. I want to pursue this, she said. I thought you might, Oak said. I want to review everything carefully before I advise you on what your options look like. Can you come to Casper tomorrow? Yes, Nora said. 9 o'clock. Bring everything physical that you found. The originals, not just the photographs. A pause. Ms. Calloway, try to get some sleep. After the call, Nora sat in the cabin as the last of the day's light left the high vents and the space around her settled into its evening dark. She lit the lantern. She set it on the shelf. She looked at the notebooks and the documents stacked neatly beside it, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, a kind of steadiness that was different from calm because it did not require the absence of fear. She picked up the fourth notebook. The final entries were written in Rupert's clearest hand, the handwriting of a man who was not in a hurry and was not writing for himself. They were written as if for a reader, written with the understanding that the person who eventually sat with these pages would need to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. He wrote about what the barn had taught him, not in sentimental terms, but in specific ones. He wrote about the discovery that most fear was architectural, that it lived in spaces that had not been properly built, and that when you understood the structure of a thing, the fear changed from formless to manageable. He wrote about the winters he had survived here and what surviving them had clarified for him, which was not that he was strong, but that strength was less important than understanding. He wrote about the family. He did not dwell on it. 2 paragraphs measured and fair. He wrote that he had seen what comfort and proximity to money had done to Lorraine over the years, and that he had watched with sadness and without surprise. He wrote that he did not believe her to be a bad person, and that he had long since stopped being angry about what she had done, because anger required a belief that things could have been otherwise, and he had given up that belief a long time ago. Then he wrote about Nora. He wrote that he had watched her from a distance over the years more than she knew. He wrote about the period after her parents' divorce, which he had observed with concern from Wyoming, unable to intervene in ways that would have been useful. He wrote about the job she had lost the previous spring, which he had known about through sources he did not specify. He wrote that he had considered calling her, then had picked up the phone 3 times and had put it back down. He wrote that the reason he had not called was not indifference. It was that he had believed, on the basis of everything he had observed about her over 30 years, that she did not need him to call, that she would manage, and that what she needed from him was not a phone call, but what she would find when she arrived at this barn if she came, which he believed she would. He wrote that he had chosen her not because she was the only one left or the most deserving in any conventional accounting of such things. He had chosen her because, in his experience, the people who were capable of inheriting something real were not the ones who wanted things most urgently, but the ones who were willing to sit with a difficult thing until they understood it. He wrote that the barn had kept him alive. He meant this in both the literal and the non-literal sense, and he did not bother to separate the two because he did not believe they were separable. He wrote that the money and the documents and the water rights and all the rest of it were not gifts. They were tools. He had found in his own life that tools given without instruction were often wasted, and so he had written the notebooks, and he had built the system of the cabin, and he had placed the keys where she would find them because he wanted her to arrive at the tools only after she had understood what they were for. He wrote that he was not afraid. He wrote that he was satisfied with what he had built, both the physical structure of this place and the less visible structure of what he was leaving inside it. He wrote that the land would take care of itself, as it always had, if the person standing on it was willing to take the time to understand what it was saying. He wrote that he was sorry he had not called. Nora set the notebook down on the stone floor of the cabin her grandfather had built, with his hands in the winters after he lost everything, and she pressed her palms flat against the cold stone and felt the solidity of something that had been made to endure. And she sat like that for a long time without moving. Outside, the Wyoming night had arrived fully. The wind moved against the outer walls of the barn with steady pressure. Inside the cabin, the air held. The lantern gave its quiet, constant light. She thought about the signature on the 2011 documents, the specific loops and angles of Lorraine's handwriting on a line that had cost Rupert everything he had worked for. She thought about the application filed weeks before the man whose land was needed had drawn his last breath, and she thought about what it meant to know something like that before you had the legal framework to do anything with it. And she recognized the feeling clearly because it was not unfamiliar to her. It was the feeling of holding a difficult thing and not yet knowing what shape it would take. Her grandfather had written that the best work was always invisible, that if you could see how something was made, the maker had not finished thinking. She was not finished thinking, but she was beginning to understand what she was thinking toward. She pulled the small envelope with her name on it from the stack of documents and turned it over in her hands. She had been setting it aside since she found it. She admitted to herself now, afraid of what it contained, not because she expected it to be devastating, but because she suspected it would be the most honest thing she had read in years, and she had not been ready for it until this moment. She broke the seal carefully and removed the single folded sheet inside. She read it in the lantern light. When she finished, she folded it along its original creases and placed it inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel the faint weight of it as she breathed. Then she picked up the third notebook again and found the page she had been on before Brent Fitch's truck had come down the access road. She found her place. She continued reading. The lantern burned steadily. The barn held against the night. She found it on the morning of the third day. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been moving through the cabin in the way she had learned to move through it over the preceding days, slowly and with attention, treating the space as a document rather than a room, reading it the way her grandfather had read land, by contact and patience rather than by scanning. She had covered the walls thoroughly. She had examined the stove and the shelf and the partial dividing wall and the floor around all of them. What remained was the floor along the east wall, the section she had saved not out of calculation, but because something about it had drawn her eye without yet giving her a reason. The stone near the east wall was laid in the same irregular pattern as the rest of the floor. Flat pieces of native rock fitted together with the artistry of someone who had done this work alone and by hand over a long period of time. The stones were cold beneath her palms when she pressed against them, as they always were, but their solidity was consistent, the resistance of things that had been placed correctly and had stayed placed, until the one near the base of the east wall, 18 inches from the corner. She felt the difference before she saw it. A slight give. Not looseness, not instability, but a flex that the surrounding stones did not have a response to pressure, that told her the stone was not resting on packed earth, but on something with a small amount of clearance beneath it. She pressed again more deliberately, and the stone moved downward by perhaps a quarter of an inch and held. She worked her fingers around the edges carefully. The stone had been cut or selected for this purpose, its underside flat, its edges fitting the surrounding stones closely enough that no gap was visible from standing height. She needed to apply even pressure from both sides simultaneously to lift it, and when she did, it came up cleanly without resistance, as if it had been designed to be lifted exactly this way. Beneath it was a steel box, not a commercial safe, but something fabricated, welded from plate steel that had been coated with a rubberized compound to resist moisture. It was roughly the size of a large shoebox, and it fit the cavity beneath the stone so precisely that it could not have been placed by accident. This had been built into the floor from the beginning. The floor had been laid around it. There was no lock. The lid was held by two simple steel clasps that released when she pressed them inward simultaneously. She opened it. The smell that rose from the interior was of metal and old paper, and the dryness of a sealed space that had kept the outside world out for a long time. The contents had been arranged with the same deliberateness she had come to expect from everything her grandfather had built or hidden or written. Nothing was loose. Nothing was casual. On top was a bundle of currency bills in mixed denominations banded in groups and labeled in pencil with amounts. She counted quickly without removing them from the box. The total was $11,400 arranged in labeled stacks, like a ledger entry made physical. Beneath the currency was a document folded in thirds, sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. She opened the sleeve and unfolded the document carefully. It was a statement from a trust account held at a bank in Casper, account number printed at the top, the trust identified by its formal name. The Nora Calloway Irrevocable Trust, established October 14, 2010. Current balance as of the most recent statement date, which was 9 months prior to this morning, was listed clearly in a number that made her sit back on her heels and breathe slowly for a moment before she continued reading. 14 years. He had been adding to it for 14 years, beginning 1 year before the original ranch sale, beginning at a point when he must have already understood or suspected that the situation around him was moving in a direction he could not fully control. He had not waited until he had something substantial to put away. The early deposits reflected in the account history attached to the statement were small. $50, $100, whatever could be extracted from circumstances that were already narrowing. And then over time, as the barn had become what it was and his expenses had contracted to what they needed to be, the deposits had become larger and more regular. He had been building two things at once, the physical structure around her and this invisible one. And both of them had been built for the same purpose, which was to make sure that when she arrived here, she would have what she needed to stand on. She set the account statement beside her on the stone floor and reached into the box for the last item. It was an envelope letter size sealed, her name on the front in the same firm hand she had read in 4 notebooks in 2 prior notes. But unlike the small envelope she had opened 2 nights ago, this one was thicker, multiple pages. And unlike that envelope, there was a second notation beneath her name, written in slightly smaller letters. Read this last. She had found it last. She did not think that was accidental. She broke the seal. The letter was 4 pages written on both sides of 2 sheets of notebook paper. The handwriting consistent throughout, no indication of multiple writing sessions in the pressure or the angle, which meant he had written it in one sitting, knowing what he wanted to say before he picked up the pen. He began without preamble. The water rights attached to this deed are worth more than everything Harlan Fitch has built in 30 years. Do not sign anything until you understand that completely. Not the deed, not a development agreement, not a survey authorization, nothing. Any document that touches this property goes through an attorney you have chosen yourself before it goes anywhere else. She read the first paragraph twice. Then she continued. He wrote that he understood this was not how people expected letters from grandfathers to begin. He wrote that he had never seen much point in beginning with sentiment when the practical reality was urgent, and that in his experience, sentiment that preceded necessary information was usually a way of softening something that should not be softened. He wrote that she deserved the information first and the sentiment after if she wanted it. He wrote about the water rights in the precise language of someone who had spent years thinking about them. The rights had been registered in 1987 under Wyoming state water law as senior appropriation rights, meaning they had priority over any later water claims in the watershed area. They were attached to the deed as an appurtenance, meaning they could not be conveyed separately without explicit agreement from the deed holder. Rupert had understood this when he filed them. He had filed them because a neighbor had suggested it in passing, and Rupert had asked enough questions to understand what the neighbor was describing and had gone to a water rights attorney in Cheyenne the following week. He wrote that he had not known at the time what those rights would eventually mean. He had filed them because they were available to him and because a man who did not protect what he had was a man asking to lose it. The knowledge of what they meant had come later, slowly accumulated from the geological report and the conversations he had overheard and the research he had done in the years when he had nothing but time and a library card and the patience to read things carefully. The aquifer beneath Section 14 was the primary water source for the entire development zone Harlan Fitch was building toward. Not a useful source, not a supplementary source. The primary one. A project of the scale Harlan had been assembling for years required permitted water access at a volume that could not be sourced elsewhere in that part of the county within any reasonable economic framework. Without the water rights attached to the deed for Section 14, the project could not proceed. Rupert wrote that he had understood this for 6 years, and for 6 years he had told no one. He wrote about why. He wrote that the obvious reason was self-protection, which was true but incomplete. If Harlan had known that Rupert understood the situation fully, the pressure to sell would have become something different. It would have become something that a 70-year-old man living alone in a barn could not have managed. The value of Harlan believing that Rupert was simply stubborn, simply an old man clinging to worthless land out of misplaced pride, was that it limited the nature of what Harlan was willing to risk. Predators, Rupert wrote, adjusted their methods to what they believed their prey understood. He had chosen to appear not to understand. He wrote that the other reason was her. He wrote that for a long time he had not been certain who should receive this. He had thought about the problem carefully and honestly in the way he tried to think about problems that mattered, which was without the distortion of what he wanted the answer to be. He had considered whether the right thing to do was to find an attorney and pursue the fraud case himself. He had considered whether to accept the money, give what he could to people who needed it. He had considered all the practical options and found problems with all of them. The problem with pursuing the case himself was that he was 76 years old, and his health had been declining in ways that his doctor had described with the careful honesty that doctors use when they are telling you something you already know. He did not have the years for a legal process that could take 3 to 5, and that Harlan's attorneys would extend at every opportunity. He had written to one attorney about the case and received a response that was technically encouraging and practically disheartening, because encouraging from an attorney meant that there was a case to be made, and practically disheartening meant that making it would cost more in time and money and energy than he currently possessed. He wrote that the option of selling had never been a real option. Not because of pride, because of arithmetic. If the water rights were what he now understood them to be, any sale that separated them from the deed would deliver the county's water future into the hands of a man who had already demonstrated with Lorraine's assistance how he intended to use resources that came into his control. Rupert wrote that he did not consider this a matter of sentiment or grievance. He considered it a matter of consequence. The families who would eventually live on the land that Harlan Fitch developed would drink from the aquifer beneath Section 14, and the terms of that water access would be set by whoever held the rights. He had thought about those families. He had thought about them a great deal. Then he wrote about her. He wrote that he had watched her over 30 years with the combination of attention and restraint that grandparents who are not permitted close access must develop or give up entirely. He had chosen attention. He had watched through her mother's updates in the early years, and then through the limited information available from family members who considered him peripheral, and then in the last 5 years, through the small amount of research available to anyone with internet access and the willingness to use it. He wrote that what he had seen was not a person who had failed. He wrote that the framing of failure was one of the central dishonest structures of the world he had lived in, a framework that measured people by outcomes without accounting for the quality of the ground they were standing on. He had watched Nora navigate circumstances that would have collapsed people with more advantages and fewer scruples. And what he had observed in the navigation was not brilliance or exceptional talent, but something he had come to believe was rarer than either. She did not run from difficult things. He wrote that in his experience, most people ran. Not obviously, not always physically, but in the subtler ways that accumulated into lives spent at a managed distance from anything that asked something real of them. He had watched his own daughter make that choice year by year, incrementally, until the distance had become her entire address. He did not judge Lorraine for this. He had tried to understand it. But he had also watched Nora, and the difference between them was not a difference in love or intelligence or any of the qualities that families measured. It was a difference in willingness to remain. He wrote that a person who was willing to remain in a difficult place until they understood it was exactly the kind of person who could be trusted with something that required understanding before it could be used. He wrote that the barn was not a refuge. He wanted to be clear about this. It was not a place to hide, not a retreat from the world, not a romantic idea about self-sufficiency. It was a tool for thinking. It was a place where the noise that made clear thinking impossible was absent, and where the problems that mattered could be given the attention they required. He had built it for himself out of necessity and had discovered that necessity had made something useful. He was leaving it to her because he believed she would understand the difference between living in a place and using a place, and because he believed the problem she was going to face required exactly what it provided. He wrote about the legal situation in the direct terms of a man who had done his homework. He wrote that the 2011 sale documents, which she would have found in the oilcloth bundle, if she had read the notebooks, carefully constituted evidence of fraud under Wyoming statute, because the transaction had been structured to benefit a party with undisclosed material interest, and because the conditions that had pressured the sale had been manufactured by the same party. He wrote that the statute of limitations had been extended by the concealment of evidence, a legal principle his Cheyenne attorney had confirmed in correspondence he had included in the file. He wrote that Meredith Oakes in Casper was the right attorney for this, and that he had researched her before deciding, and that she had the temperament for a case that would require patience and precision rather than drama. He had researched Nora's attorney before Nora had called her. In the final paragraph, he wrote about the land itself. He wrote that 42 acres of Wyoming high plains, a stone floor, a cast iron stove, and water rights to a confined aquifer were not, by the standards of the world that had dismissed him, a significant inheritance. He wrote that he was aware of this and had never found it troubling because the standards of that world had always seemed to him to measure the wrong things. What he was leaving her was not wealth in the form that world recognized. It was position. A place to stand that could not be moved. A set of tools for a specific set of problems that were already in motion. He wrote that he was sorry he had not called. He wrote it plainly without qualification or explanation because he had thought about it enough to know that qualifications were a way of apologizing while reserving the right not to have been wrong, and he did not want to do that. He had not called. He should have. He was sorry. He wrote that he loved her. He put it at the end where it belonged, after the information, after the instruction, after the honest accounting of what he had done and not done. He wrote it in 3 words without modification, the same way he had built things his entire life, with nothing included that was not necessary and nothing necessary left out. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it inside her coat. She sat for a long time on the stone floor with the open box beside her, and the morning light coming through the high vents at a low angle, and the barn settling in the cold around her, making its small sounds of wood and wind and permanence. She did not cry. She had thought she might reading it and had felt the pressure of it building in certain sentences, but what arrived instead was something that felt less like grief and more like gravity, the weight of being known by someone who was no longer present to know you, which was a kind of presence all its own. She closed the box. She replaced the stone. She pressed it down until it sat flush with the surrounding floor. Then she stood up, put on her coat, picked up the documents, and went to meet Meredith Oakes. The drive to Casper was 41 miles of gravel and then pavement, and she drove it with the manila folder of documents on the passenger seat and the letter against her chest, and the clarity of a person who has finished deciding something and is now simply moving toward the next necessary thing. Meredith Oakes' office was on the 2nd floor of a building 3 blocks from the county courthouse. A practical space with good light and the organized surfaces of someone who processed large amounts of paper and did not allow it to accumulate into confusion. Oakes herself was 51 with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck, and a manner that was precise without being cold. She shook Nora's hand, pointed to a chair, and said she had coffee if Nora wanted it. Nora said yes. They spent 3 hours going through the documents. Oakes worked through them in the order Nora described, finding them, asking questions at intervals that were specific and technical, the kind of questions that were not seeking narrative, but confirming legal elements. She examined the 2011 sale agreement with the attention of a person reading a contract who knows what to look for, following specific clauses with her fingertip, occasionally making a small notation on the legal pad beside her. When she reached the signature page with Lorraine's name, she paused for a longer time than she had paused at anything else. "You recognize this signature as your aunt's?" she asked. "Yes," Nora said. "You've seen it before in other contexts." "On a birthday card when I was approximately 13. On a document my mother showed me related to my parents' separation. On the card she sent when I graduated from college." Oakes made a note. "That's sufficient for identification purposes. A handwriting expert can confirm, but the comparison samples you've described are adequate to proceed." She continued through the geological report and the water rights addendum. When she finished reading the addendum, she set it down and folded her hands on the desk and looked at Nora directly. "I pulled the full Converse County filing history yesterday," she said. "The LLC that filed the development application is registered in Delaware as Meridian Basin Holdings. The registered agent is a legal firm in Wilmington. The beneficial ownership isn't disclosed in the Delaware filing, which is legal but not informative." She paused. "However, the project application filed with the county commission lists a local contact as the project representative. The name on the contact line is Harlan Fitch." Nora said nothing. "Wyoming has relatively strong provisions for fraud in real estate transactions." Oakes continued, "particularly where the fraudulent conduct involves concealment of material information or manufactured conditions affecting the seller's decision. The statute of limitations is 8 years from discovery of the fraud, not from the date of the transaction. That's the critical piece. Your grandfather wrote in the notebooks that he became aware of the full scope of what had happened to him in approximately 2014, 3 years after the sale. That moves our discovery date forward to 2014, which means the statute of limitations runs to 2022 at the earliest, and that's before we account for active concealment." She looked at her notes. The letters he included in the file, the ones from Harlan's attorneys warning him against pursuing claims, arguably constitute active concealment, which can further extend the limitations period under Wyoming case law. "We have a case," Nora said. It was not a question. "You have evidence sufficient to file a complaint and survive a motion to dismiss," Oakes said. "Whether you have a case in the broader sense depends on what discovery produces. But yes, what your grandfather left in those walls is more than enough to begin." Nora nodded once. "I want to file," she said. Oakes studied her for a moment, not with doubt, but with the assessment of an attorney who needed to understand the person she was representing before she committed to a course of action. "I want to be direct with you about what this involves," she said. "Harlan Fitch is not going to receive a complaint without responding aggressively. He has resources. He will hire good attorneys. This will not be fast." "I understand that," Nora said. "The water rights issue complicates things in a way that may actually work in your favor," Oakes said. "If Meridian Basin Holdings needs your water rights to proceed with the Converse County project, the active litigation will put the development on hold for as long as the case is pending. That's leverage he won't be able to ignore indefinitely." Nora thought about her grandfather writing, "I think they've been waiting for me to die." She thought about the application filed 3 weeks before his last breath. "Good," she said. Oakes made a final note and looked up. "One more thing I found in the county records that I want you to be aware of." She pulled a printed page from a folder and placed it in front of Nora. "Over the past 26 months, Meridian Basin Holdings has acquired 3 parcels adjacent to your property, northeast and south." She indicated the parcels on a county map, 3 colored areas that surrounded Section 14 on 3 sides. "The western boundary of your property is the county road, which is public, but the other 3 sides are now owned by the same entity that wants your water rights." Nora looked at the map. "They're trying to box me in," she said. "It's a strategy," Oakes said carefully. Surround the property you need, create practical difficulties for access, and use. Increase the pressure on the holder to sell. It doesn't work as a legal mechanism because your access rights from the county road can't be extinguished. But as a psychological strategy, it's effective if the target doesn't understand what's happening. Nora was still looking at the map. She was thinking about her grandfather in 2019, pulling out the geological report after the conversation in the Douglas hardware store, reading it again with fresh understanding. She was thinking about a man who had seen this strategy developing around him and had known he would not live long enough to fully counter it himself. She was thinking about an easement. The access road, she said. The one from the county road to the barn. Is there any recorded protection on it? Oakes paused. She looked at Nora with an expression that had shifted slightly. She picked up her phone, accessed a database, and typed for perhaps 45 seconds. Then she was still for a moment. There is an access easement recorded with the county, she said, and her voice had changed in the precise way that voices change when a person has found something they did not expect. Filed in March of 1991, it establishes a permanent, irrevocable right-of-way along the existing access road corridor from the county road to Section 14, running with the land binding on all successors and assigns of the surrounding parcels. She set the phone down. It's been in the county records for 33 years. Any title search on any of those 3 adjacent parcels would have revealed it. She looked at Nora. Whoever acquired those parcels bought them knowing this easement existed. They bought them knowing, Nora said quietly. Yes, which means they acquired adjacent land to create pressure while knowing the strategy could not legally extinguish access. Oakes was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather filed that easement in 1991. He would have been in his mid-40s, long before any of this began. Nora sat with that. Rupert Calloway, at 44 years old, filing an access easement with Converse County. Not because anything threatened him yet, not because he had reason to believe anything ever would, but because a man who read land carefully enough understood that protection was most effective when it was installed before it was needed. He had not outmaneuvered Harlan Fitch. He had simply finished the board before Harlan sat down to play. Oakes began the filing process the following week. The complaint was 47 pages attaching 41 exhibits, and it named Harlan Fitch and Lorraine Calloway Fitch as defendants in a civil fraud action relating to the 2011 acquisition of the original Calloway Ranch and the conditions manufactured to compel its sale. A separate filing addressed the Converse County development application requesting a review hold pending resolution of the civil matter. Oakes filed both documents on a Thursday morning and called Nora to confirm before noon. It's in, Oakes said. Harlan's firm will be served today. Nora was standing outside the barn when the call came in the pale December light, the cold sharp and clean against her face. She said thank you and ended the call and stood for a moment in the quiet of the open land. The response came in 48 hours. Harlan's legal team was a Cheyenne firm with 12 attorneys, and the initial response was exactly what Oakes had predicted, aggressive and comprehensive, challenging the standing of the complaint, the timeliness of the filing, the admissibility of the documents found in the property. It was the response of a legal apparatus designed to make litigation expensive and slow to exhaust opposing counsel with volume rather than substance. Oakes had expected it. She had told Nora to expect it. She responded with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this, and the first round of motions resolved in a way that left the complaint intact and the development application on hold. Harlan came to the barn on a Saturday morning in late December. Nora had been expecting him for days in the way you expect something when you understand the logic of the situation well enough. Brent had been the opening move sent ahead to assess to offer to test the response. Oakes had been a complication. The formal complaint had been an escalation. And now the man who had built a career on the principle that every situation had a price point was going to arrive in person to find hers. She heard his truck on the access road and went outside. He was alone. No Brent, no assistant. Just Harlan Fitch at 58, broader somehow than he had seemed at the conference table, the ranch coat and the open land, doing nothing to reduce the impression of a man who occupied space as a matter of habit. He had the manner of someone accustomed to having things arranged around him, and he recalibrated visibly when he saw Nora standing in front of the barn without any indication of moving toward him. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the barn. He looked at the land around it in the proprietary way that developers look at land they have decided belongs in a different category of use. Then he looked at Nora. "You've created a problem," he said, not angrily, in the tone of a man describing a complication in an otherwise manageable situation. "Have I?" Nora said. "For yourself, mostly." He put his hands in his coat pockets. The gesture was casual, studied. "You're a 30-year-old woman from Denver with no income, no legal background, and no resources for a protracted court fight. You've hired a competent small-town attorney with a good local reputation and no experience with the kind of litigation this is going to become." He paused. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you're smart enough to hear it honestly." Nora looked at him without expression. "I'll be straight with you," he said. "The number I authorized Brent to offer you was a starting point. It's not the ceiling. We can talk about something significantly more substantial structured however works for your situation. Lump sum trust annuity, whatever makes sense." He shifted his weight. "The alternative is years of litigation that you will not enjoy and that will not ultimately change the outcome." The cold moved between them. The barn behind Nora was quiet and still. She thought about the letter inside her coat, 4 pages in her grandfather's hand, that had described this moment with the accuracy of a man who had already lived it in his mind. She thought about the steel box under the east wall stone, the stacked currency, and the trust account, and the 14 years of quiet preparation they represented. She thought about the easement filed in 1991, 33 years old, sitting in the county records like a lock installed on a door before anyone knew the door would ever need one. She asked the question, "Did you know he was dying before you filed the application?" Harlan's face did not change, but something behind it did, a subtle adjustment in the quality of his composure, the kind of shift that happens when a question arrives from a direction that was not fully anticipated. He did not answer. They stood in the cold for a moment that was not long in duration and very long in every other sense. "My attorney will be in touch," Nora said. Harlan looked at her for another moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible for the first time, not the composed assessment she had watched at the conference table, but something more effortful, a man revising a framework that was no longer producing useful results. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something, and walked back to his truck. Nora watched him drive away down the access road, the winter pale land on either side of it bare and open. The road itself straight and clear, running from the county road to where she stood without obstruction, as it had run for 33 years, as it would continue to run, regardless of who owned the parcels on either side of it. She went back inside. The winter deepened. The legal process moved at the pace of legal processes, which was not fast, but it moved. Oakes was a methodical correspondent, sending Nora updates at intervals that were frequent enough to convey control and infrequent enough to convey that nothing was being sent that was not worth sending. The discovery process began. Documents were requested. Harlan's attorneys produced some of what was requested and objected to producing the rest, and Oakes pursued the objections with the steady persistence of a person who had expected them and was not bothered. In January, the Converse County Commission received a formal inquiry from the Wyoming State Engineer's Office regarding the water rights associated with Section 14, triggered by the hold on the development application. The inquiry was procedural and preliminary, but its existence was noted in the county records and was, Oakes explained to Nora, not the kind of attention that a developer in the middle of a fraud complaint wanted drawn to a project that depended on water rights it did not yet control. In February, 2 of Harlan's 12 attorneys withdrew from the matter. Oakes called Nora to tell her this without editorializing, though Nora could hear in the careful neutrality of her voice that it was significant. Through all of it, Nora stayed at the barn. Not continuously, she made trips to Casper for meetings, trips to Denver to manage the contracting work that was paying her expenses, trips to the library in Douglas, where the internet was reliable, and the librarian had stopped noticing her presence with anything other than a brief nod. She moved between the world and the barn with a regularity that became its own kind of routine. Each return to the inner cabin, a recalibration, a return to the quality of thinking that the walls made possible. She repaired things. She replaced two boards on the northeast corner of the barn's exterior that had split badly over a succession of winters and had reached the point where they were compromising the wall's integrity. She sourced the lumber from a yard in Douglas and selected it the way her grandfather's notebooks had described selecting it for thickness and grain and the density that indicated wood dried slowly rather than fast. She fitted the new boards against the old ones and felt the difference in her hands between wood that had been in place for 70 years and wood that was new, and understood that over time, the difference would diminish, that the barn would absorb the repair the way it had absorbed everything else slowly and without announcement. She read. She worked through the county records. She had obtained copies of developing a picture of the land's history that went back further than the 2011 sale, further than Harlan Fitch, further than Rupert's adult life. The land had a history that preceded all of them, a record of use and ownership, and the relationship between people and ground that accumulated over generations in ways that were only visible if you looked for them. She understood working through those records what her grandfather had meant when he said that some places kept people alive. It was not mysticism. It was the reality that certain kinds of land and the knowledge attached to them constituted a form of stability that was not available through any other means. The barn had not been Rupert's consolation prize. It had been his strategic retreat to a position that could not be flanked. She thought about that often in the months that followed. In March, Harlan's legal team made a settlement approach through Oaks. The offer was substantial, structured as a purchase of the property with a separate agreement regarding the water rights. Oaks presented it to Nora without recommendation, laying out the practical implications in both directions. Nora declined. She declined not because the amount was insufficient, though Oaks had made clear it could be negotiated higher. She declined because the offer required conveying the water rights, and she had read her grandfather's letter enough times to understand why that was not a transaction she was willing to complete, regardless of the number attached to it. Oaks transmitted the rejection without editorial comment. The settlement discussions ended. The weeks after the settlement rejection brought a different kind of pressure, quieter and more indirect than the legal maneuvering that had preceded it. Messages arrived from cousins Nora barely knew, people who had sat at the far end of the conference table and said nothing during the will reading, now reaching out with the carefully constructed warmth of people who believed they were owed something and were choosing a gentle approach first. They wrote about family, about legacy, about what Rupert would have wanted, as if they had known him better than the notebook suggested they had. They wrote about the difficulty of watching a family fracture over property, as if the fracture had begun with Nora's decision, rather than with a document signed in 2011. Nora read each message once and set her phone face down on the shelf. Lorraine called twice. The first call Nora did not answer. The second she answered out of a kind of clinical curiosity, wanting to hear what register Lorraine had chosen for this stage of the process. Lorraine's voice was composed and measured, occupying a careful middle ground between warmth and formality. She said that she hoped Nora understood that none of this had been intended to hurt her. She said that Rupert had been a difficult man in his later years, that people who knew him had been worried that some of the decisions he had made in his final years raised questions about his judgment. She did not say the word competency directly, but the word was present in the architecture of the conversation waiting to be deployed. Nora listened to all of it. Then she said that she appreciated Lorraine calling and that her attorney would handle any further correspondence, and she ended the call. She stood in the doorway of the inner cabin for a moment afterward, looking at the shelf where the notebooks sat at the walls her grandfather had built with material he had found or scavenged or saved for at the stone floor that had absorbed the winters he had survived there alone. The idea that a man who had constructed this, who had documented everything he knew in 4 careful notebooks, who had commissioned geological reports and consulted water rights attorneys and filed easements and established irrevocable trusts, had done any of it without full command of his faculties was not a serious idea. It was a legal tactic wearing the clothing of concern. She understood clearly and without anger that the phase of indirect pressure had begun because the direct approach had not worked. And she understood because her grandfather had written about exactly this in the second notebook, describing the same dynamic from the 2011 period, that the indirect approach was not a retreat. It was a test of endurance designed to accumulate over time until the weight of it tipped a calculation that money alone had not been able to tip. She went back to work. Spring came to Converse County in the incremental, unglamorous way it always came to Wyoming, not as an arrival, but as a gradual reduction of resistance. Snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the open ground, then from the base of the barn's north wall, the last place winter gave up its hold. The sage began to show green at its base before the upper branches showed any change. The light came at a different angle in the morning and stayed longer in the evening, and the air lost its particular cutting quality and became simply cold, which was different. During those weeks, as the season changed around the barn, Nora found herself moving through time differently than she had in Denver. In the city, time had been a pressure, the kind measured in rent due dates and contract deadlines, and the accumulating weight of things that had not been resolved. Here, time was something else. It was a material. It was the medium in which the barn had been built, and the medium in which her grandfather had conducted the quiet, patient work of protecting what he had left for her. Being inside it, really inside it, felt different from trying to outrun it. She thought about the entries from that first December in the notebooks. No heat except what I make. Starting from scratch. She had been starting from scratch for 6 months now, and the phrase had changed meaning on her twice. The first time she had read it sitting on the stone floor with a notebook in her hands, it had sounded like desolation. The second time, after a winter in which she had watched the walls hold and felt the warmth accumulate through stone and wood, it sounded like a beginning. Not a comfortable beginning. Not a beginning anyone would choose if other options were available. But a beginning that was real, grounded in the actual materials of a situation, rather than in the borrowed certainty of a stability she had not built herself. Starting from scratch was not the same as starting from nothing. That distinction had mattered to Rupert Calloway, and she was beginning to understand why. On a morning in late April, Nora stood outside the barn and watched the snow melt. It was not a dramatic process. The surface of the frozen ground near the barn's base had begun to show dark earth sooner than the surrounding area. The heat moving outward through the stone floor and the insulated walls and radiating into the ground beneath in a circle that was subtle but unmistakable. The snow that had covered the land in an even sheet had retreated in this one area, first revealing black earth that steamed faintly in the morning cold. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She had been standing in the same spot, in the same morning light on the morning she arrived, looking at a structure she had believed for approximately 4 hours was the confirmation of her irrelevance to the people who had assigned her value their entire lives. She had been wrong about what she was looking at. She had stayed long enough to understand that she was wrong, and the understanding had changed everything that came after it. Her grandfather had not left her a piece of agricultural land of limited utility. He had left her a position, a place to stand that could not be moved, a set of tools for problems that were already in motion, assembled with the patience of a man who had understood, perhaps long before anyone else had bothered to think about it, that the people who lasted were not the ones with the most resources at the moment of crisis, but the ones who had built correctly before the crisis arrived. The legal case was still in process. It would continue to be in process for a period of time that could not be precisely estimated and was not worth worrying about in the abstract. Oakes was methodical and patient, and had in a recent conversation used the phrase favorable trajectory without being asked, which Nora had filed as a data point without allowing it to become expectation. Harlan and Lorraine had retained new counsel. The Converse County development application remained on hold. The water rights remained attached to the deed for Section 14, as they had been for 37 years, as they would remain for as long as she held the deed. She was going to hold the deed. She had not announced this to anyone. There was no announcement to make. The decision had been made in the same way the barn had been built, not as a single moment of resolution, but as the cumulative result of many small acts of attention, each one adding to the last until the structure was too solid to question. She looked at the circle of bare earth around the barn's base and felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph and was not relief, though it contained elements of both. It was closer to the feeling of a long calculation finally resolving the moment when the numbers that have been moving through your mind for weeks or months align in a way that shows you the answer, and the answer turns out to be simpler than the process of finding it suggested. She went inside. She had been thinking about what to name the land, not the barn, which did not need a name because the barn was what it was. The land, the 42 acres of Converse County, Section 14, that had come to her through a line of decisions stretching back to 1987, when a man in his 40s had filed a water rights claim because a neighbor had mentioned it in passing, and he had been the kind of person who asked enough questions to understand what he was being told. She had been thinking about it for weeks, turning possibilities over in the quiet of the inner cabin in the evenings, applying the same standards she had come to apply to other things, which was not what sounded right, but what was accurate. She stood in the center of the cabin in the room her grandfather had built inside the barn he had kept alive during the years when everything else was being taken or lost or worn down to nothing. And she looked at the stone floor and the cast iron stove and the shelf worn smooth by a hand she would not feel again. And she understood that whatever name she chose, it would not be the name of what she had inherited. It would be the name of what she was keeping. She thought about the geological report, the aquifer beneath the ground she was standing on, patient and enormous and invisible holding water that had accumulated over centuries in the specific geology of the high plains, indifferent to the arguments of the people on the surface above it, simply present, simply enduring, available to whoever was willing to understand it. She thought about her grandfather writing about the barn keeping him alive, about the entry for that first December. No heat except what I make. Starting from scratch. Starting from scratch was not the same as starting from nothing. That distinction had mattered to Rupert Callaway, and she understood now why it had mattered, because starting from nothing was a condition of absence, and starting from scratch was a condition of presence. It was the difference between a man who had lost everything and a man who had returned to the beginning of the question and decided to answer it correctly this time. She had not started from nothing. She had started from a barn in Wyoming, a geological report, a set of water rights, an access easement filed in 1991, 14 years of trust, deposits, and 4 notebooks written in the hand of someone who had thought carefully about all of it and had left the thinking where she could find it. She walked to the shelf and placed her palm flat against the wood, the way she had on the first day, feeling the cold of it, and the density behind it, and the resistance of something built to last. Outside, the morning light was moving across the land in the slow way that April light moved at a low angle that caught the sage and pulled silver from it and made the open country look for a few minutes each morning like something that had been arranged by someone who understood what they were doing. She stood with her hand against the wall her grandfather had built and listened to the barn settle in the warming air and felt the weight of a place that had been kept not by accident, not by fortune, but by choice year after year through everything. She named the land quietly to herself in the empty room. She did not need to say it to anyone else. She did not need to announce it or record it or put it on a sign at the edge of the county road. The naming was between her and the land, and the man who had left it to her with a letter that began with water rights and ended with love because he had understood, as she was beginning to understand, that the practical and the profound were not different things, but the same thing seen from different distances. The lantern on the shelf held its steady light. The walls held against the morning. And outside, the snow continued its patient retreat from the circle of ground around the barn's base, the dark earth emerging into the April air, warmed from beneath, ready to receive whatever the season brought next.